April 18, 1942. Dawn had barely broken over the rolling gray swells of the North Pacific when history tilted on its axis. A cold wind swept across the steel deck of the USS Hornet, biting the exposed faces of the aircrews preparing for a mission no American bomber pilot had ever attempted. Some men tightened their flight jackets, others stared silently toward the horizon, their eyes tracing the line where the sky met the sea. They knew that beyond that horizon lay Japan, the heart of an empire that, only months earlier, had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating force. It had been 132 days since America's Pacific Fleet had been crippled. The United States was still stumbling out of the shock of December 7th, its grief still raw, its anger still searching for direction. Across the Pacific, Imperial Japan surged with confidence, sweeping across the Philippines, capturing Singapore, threatening Australia. The world watched as the rising sun spread across maps like an unstoppable tide. But on this cold April morning, on the deck of a lone American carrier deep in enemy waters, something unprecedented was about to happen, something that would fracture the illusion of Japanese invincibility and ignite a flame that would burn across every front of the war. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, land-based medium bombers never designed to take off from a carrier, sat lined in formation, their wings nearly touching. Painted olive drab, marked with hastily assembled modifications, they looked almost out of place, like giants perched on an arena meant for smaller fighters. They represented improvisation, desperation, and daring in equal measure. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, aviation pioneer, scientist, and risk-taker, the crews were about to embark on a mission whose odds of success were barely better than the odds of survival. Doolittle moved down the line, offering each crew a brief nod, but behind his calm expression stirred a weight he dared not show. The men believed in him. They believed in the mission. But the mission had been one of audacity from the start: launch bombers from a carrier, strike Tokyo and other Japanese cities, then continue westward, not to return to Hornet, but to try to reach China, knowing full well that reaching friendly territory was uncertain and that capture by enemy forces was a very real possibility. The tension on deck thickened when the lookouts sounded the alarm. Japanese picket boats had sighted the American task force. Although the boats were swiftly destroyed, the damage was done. The element of surprise was at risk. Admiral William "Bull" Halsey made the call: launch immediately, even though they were far outside the planned range. The decision meant the crews would almost certainly run out of fuel before reaching safe airfields. No one argued. Engines roared to life. The wind picked up. The carrier pitched and rolled through the swells. And then, just after 8 a.m., Doolittle's bomber inched forward, its twin right engines vibrating with a low growl. The deck, slick with sea spray, narrowed to a thin ribbon ending in a plunge into the vast Pacific. Every man watching, sailor, officer, or aircrew, held his breath. Doolittle throttled forward. The bomber surged ahead. The wheels lifted. And with that, the impossible became real. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers followed, each takeoff a miracle in itself. As they vanished into the sky, cheers erupted across the deck. But the mission's meaning extended far beyond the immediate danger. These aircraft were not merely metal and fuel. They carried something much heavier: a message, a declaration, a promise to a nation still wounded but unbroken. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo, life on that same morning moved with predictable rhythm. Children walked to school. Workers boarded streetcars. Housewives prepared breakfast. In the heart of the imperial capital, few imagined that the war they had begun across distant oceans might reach their own city. Japan's confidence bordered on certainty. The Americans, after Pearl Harbor, were considered disheartened and on the defensive. Any real counterstrike, especially one reaching the Japanese homeland, seemed impossible. But the sky was changing. In a matter of hours, air raid sirens would blare across Tokyo and other cities. Civilians would look upward in confusion, then fear. Japanese military leadership would stare at reports in stunned disbelief. And the emperor's war planners would come to a chilling realization: they had underestimated the United States, gravely. The Doolittle raid, modest in its physical damage, would deliver a psychological shock of immense proportions. Its bombs were symbolic thunderclaps reverberating across the Pacific. It forced Japan to re-evaluate its strategies, accelerate planned offensives, and lash out defensively. And, perhaps most importantly, it reminded America, still reeling, still burying its dead, that the fight was far from over. This was not revenge. This was a warning. A sign that the Americans, though wounded, though unprepared, though underestimated, were only at the beginning of their fight. And this is the story of how a single daring raid, born from desperation, executed with courage, and remembered with awe, shifted the momentum of a global war. The news of the Doolittle raid spread across the Pacific like a ripple of disbelief. For Americans still struggling through the dark winter of early 1942, the announcement that Tokyo had been bombed electrified the nation. Headlines blared the impossible truth, celebrations erupted in towns across the United States, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans felt momentum shifting. But while the shockwaves of the raid boosted morale in the United States, their effects in Japan were far more complicated and far more consequential. What had begun as a daring gesture of resolve would soon escalate into a strategic transformation, altering the trajectory of the entire Pacific War. The air crews who carried out the raid had only a vague understanding of its potential magnitude. As their bombers approached the Japanese mainland, they flew low over choppy seas, navigating winds far stronger than forecasts had suggested. Some crews encountered fishing boats, others skirted islands whose inhabitants could easily have alerted Japanese patrols. Yet the weather held just enough fog and cloud cover to obscure their approach. 4 hours, the aircraft maintained radio silence, alone in hostile skies. The men inside the bombers passed the time by checking fuel gauges, as if constant rechecking could somehow stretch the dwindling reserves, reviewing escape plans, or simply staring ahead at the horizon that slowly brightened with the distant glow of an immense city. Then, the coast of Japan emerged, densely packed villages, terraced farmland, narrow roads, rail lines glinting like threads of silver. Civilians looked up from their fields and errands, confused to see American aircraft at low altitude. Some waved, mistaking the B-25s for Japanese planes they did not recognize. Others froze in uncertainty, sensing something was wrong. In the cockpit of Doolittle's lead aircraft, the moment Tokyo appeared through the haze brought a profound stillness. For years, American military planners had studied maps and photographs of the city. Now, Doolittle and his crew were among the first American combat aviators ever to behold it directly. Beneath them lay a metropolis of millions, sprawling, organized, and unprepared. Doolittle's bomb bay doors opened with a metallic shudder. Seconds later, the first bombs of the raid dropped toward the industrial district of Tokyo. Explosions blossomed across warehouse roofs, factories, and military facilities. Fires erupted in sudden bursts. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life, scattering black puffs across the sky, but the gunners struggled to track the swift, low-flying aircraft. Doolittle's bomber banked hard, skimming over rooftops as startled civilians scrambled for shelter. Behind him, other B-25s struck targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Each release of bombs served the same purpose: to demonstrate that Japan's homeland was not beyond reach. For the Japanese leadership, the raid was a humiliation. How could American bombers penetrate the homeland's defenses? How had the Imperial Navy failed to detect a carrier group operating so close to Japan? The psychological blow rippled through military circles. What the Americans had achieved was small in physical damage but immense in symbolism. Japanese hardliners, furious at the breach of their homeland sanctity, demanded decisive action. The raid fed insecurities within the Imperial Navy, reinforcing arguments for a bold plan that had been forming for months, an operation intended to crush the United States' remaining carriers in a single, decisive blow. That plan would culminate at Midway. Meanwhile, for the men conducting the raid, the escape became a desperate race against time. With fuel dwindling and night falling, the bombers pressed onward toward the Chinese coast, hoping to reach makeshift landing strips that had been prepared under secrecy. But the early launch from Hornet turned an already perilous journey into an impossible one. Fuel gauges dropped relentlessly. Engines coughed. Pilots exchanged urgent glances with navigators who confirmed what everyone already knew: they would never reach their intended destinations. One by one, the B-25 crews faced impossible choices. Some held altitude until their tanks ran dry, then ordered bailouts over dark, mountainous terrain. Others approached the Chinese coast and ditched in violent surf. Parachutes burst open across unfamiliar countryside, leaving crew members scattered, injured, or disoriented. Many landed near villages whose residents had never before seen foreigners. Chinese civilians risked their lives to help the airmen, guiding them through Japanese-occupied territory, hiding them from patrols, and providing food and shelter. Their bravery saved lives, but it also provoked a brutal Japanese response. In retaliation for Chinese assistance to the American raiders, Japanese forces launched sweeping reprisals across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, resulting in mass killings and devastation. The raid's consequences, therefore, were felt not only by the Japanese and Americans but tragically by Chinese civilians caught in the crossfire of empire and resistance. Doolittle himself bailed out over China, landing roughly among trees that tore at his uniform. When he finally reached friendly Chinese forces, he feared he might face court-martial upon returning to the United States. Every one of the raid's aircraft had been lost, the strategic damage inflicted appeared minimal, and the cost to China was severe. But he underestimated the effect his mission had already had back home. When Doolittle returned to America, he was celebrated as a hero, promoted 2 ranks, and awarded the Medal of Honor. His daring had symbolized America's resurgence, proof that the nation would not wait passively for the war to turn in its favor. News of the raid reverberated through the ranks of American servicemen around the world. Soldiers in training camps wrote home that they had been inspired. Sailors across the Pacific heard the story and felt their morale strengthen. Even service members in Europe took notice. If the Japanese home islands were vulnerable, perhaps the war was not destined to stretch endlessly into the future. The raid provided the United States with a psychological weapon: confidence. Yet if the raid boosted American morale, it plunged the Japanese high command into a state of alarm. The Imperial Navy had prided itself on being the shield of the nation, the most formidable maritime power in the Pacific. But if American carriers could slip close enough to launch bombers at Tokyo, then the perimeter that Japan had built through months of conquest suddenly seemed fragile. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, felt personally responsible. He had believed the United States would be demoralized and slow to recover. The Doolittle raid proved the opposite. Now, he argued, Japan had only one path forward: draw the United States Navy into a decisive battle that would annihilate its remaining carrier force. Without such a victory, he warned, Japan would face a long war it could not hope to win. This urgency drove Japan to accelerate operations in the Central Pacific, leading directly to the Battle of the Coral Sea and, more importantly, to the planning of an ambitious strike on Midway Atoll. Yamamoto's goal was to seize Midway, lure American carriers into a trap, and destroy them. The Doolittle raid pushed the timeline forward, tightening strategic calculations, and cementing Yamamoto's belief that decisive action was necessary before the Americans grew too strong. This urgency drove Japan to accelerate operations in the Central Pacific, leading directly to the Battle of the Coral Sea and, more importantly, to the planning of an ambitious strike on Midway Atoll. Yamamoto's goal was to seize Midway, lure American carriers into a trap, and destroy them. The Doolittle raid pushed the timeline forward, tightening strategic calculations, and cementing Yamamoto's belief that decisive action was necessary before the Americans grew too strong. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Roosevelt capitalized on the raid's success. When reporters demanded to know where the bombers had come from, he famously replied, "They came from our secret base at Shangri-La," referencing the fictional Himalayan retreat from James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. The quip not only preserved operational secrecy but also added mystique to the mission. For citizens hungry for hope, the idea of a daring strike launched from a mythical place symbolized America's ingenuity and determination. But behind the scenes, military planners recognized deeper implications. The raid demonstrated the versatility of aircraft carriers and reinforced the idea that naval aviation would dominate Pacific operations. Carrier-based power projection, once considered a complement to battleships, now proved capable of reaching enemy homelands and striking targets once assumed safe by distance alone. The raid accelerated America's shift from battleship-centric doctrine to carrier-led strategy, a transformation that would define the rest of the Pacific War. American industry, too, took inspiration. Factories ramped up aircraft production with a new sense of urgency. Workers felt personally involved in turning the tide. Posters celebrating the raid appeared across cities, reminding Americans that courage and innovation could overcome even the most daunting circumstances. The psychological boost helped sustain the nation through the difficult months that followed, including defeats in the Philippines and setbacks in the early Aleutian campaign. For the Japanese populace, the raid shattered assumptions of invulnerability. Civilians who had once believed the war existed far beyond their shores now faced the unsettling truth that American forces could reach them. Many had never imagined their homeland could be attacked so early in the conflict. Fear mixed with anger, fueling support for even more aggressive military action. Yet some quietly questioned the government's assurances that the war would be swift and victorious. The raid seeded doubt, small at first, but destined to grow. In the months following the attack, Japanese defenses around the home islands were strengthened. Anti-aircraft batteries multiplied. Fighter patrols increased. Radar installations expanded. Resources were reallocated from other fronts to reinforce the homeland security. The Doolittle raid had forced Japan to divert attention and material from its outward expansion, another subtle but significant strategic effect. As the war moved into mid-1942, the effects of the raid continued to reverberate. American cryptanalysts, working tirelessly to break Japanese naval codes, found new opportunities as the Japanese military communicated more urgently and frequently in the wake of the raid. These breakthroughs helped provide critical intelligence that would lead to American success at Midway. While the raid itself had not been planned with code-breaking in mind, its psychological effects set off a chain of decisions that ultimately advantaged the United States. The raid also influenced American-Chinese cooperation. Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek used the event to press the United States for more support, emphasizing the sacrifices China had made in rescuing the raiders. Although strained by cultural and political differences, Sino-American cooperation deepened as both nations recognized the necessity of resisting Japanese expansion. The raid became a symbol of shared struggle and mutual reliance. For the families of the raiders, the weeks after the attack were a period of anxious waiting. Official news was limited. Rumors spread. Newspapers published partial lists of crew names, but uncertainty persisted. Then, slowly, reports trickled in. Some raiders had been rescued by Chinese villagers and guerrillas, some had been captured by Japanese forces, and some were simply missing. The raid, though celebrated, carried personal losses that underscored the human cost of war. Among the most tragic stories were those of the captured raiders. 8 men fell into Japanese hands. They were interrogated, tortured, and subjected to harsh conditions. 3 were executed in October 1942, becoming martyrs in the eyes of their nation. Others endured imprisonment until the war's end. Their suffering became part of the raid's legacy, a reminder that courage often carries a price not seen in triumphant headlines. Yet despite the dangers, the raid survivors believed they had done something necessary. They had struck a blow, not to cripple Japan militarily, but to awaken America spiritually. They had shown that the war was not one-sided, that determination could overcome disadvantage, and that even in the darkest periods, resolve could reshape reality. The Doolittle raid did not win the war. It did not destroy Japan's industrial capacity or halt its offensives. But it achieved something more elusive and arguably more powerful. It changed perceptions. It reminded the world that the United States, though wounded, was not broken. It pushed Japan into strategic overreach. It galvanized cooperation among allied nations. It reshaped naval doctrine. And it set the stage for events that would dramatically shift the war's momentum. The raid was small in scale, 16 bombers, 80 men, but its impact was enormous, radiating outward through every interconnected front of the Pacific conflict. In war, moments of daring can sometimes matter as much as battles. The Doolittle raid was one of those moments. In the aftermath of the Doolittle raid, as the flames in Tokyo smoldered and the Pacific winds carried away the last echoes of the B-25 engines, the world stood on the cusp of a transformation it could not yet see. The raid had lasted only a few hours. Its material damage was limited. Its aircraft were lost. Its crews scattered across China, hunted, rescued, hidden, captured. And yet, in those few hours, something irreversible had happened. A line had been drawn, not on maps, but on hearts, minds, and the strategic pathways of nations now bound to a long and brutal conflict. The raid's legacy began not with its bombs, but with its symbolism. To the American people, the Doolittle raid became proof that courage could fill the gaps where machinery or preparation fell short. It reminded a wounded nation that boldness was still part of its identity. In homes from Boston to San Francisco, citizens read newspaper articles aloud to their families, tracing the flight paths printed in thick black ink. Men and women working in defense factories tacked photographs of the raiders above their stations. School children reenacted the takeoff from the USS Hornet with toy planes made from scrap metal and wood. For the first time since December 7th, Americans allowed themselves to believe, not in an easy victory, but in the possibility of one. The psychological shift carried into every sphere of American life. Army recruiters noticed a spike in enlistments. War bond purchases surged. Communities held parades in honor of the raiders, even before many of the men had returned home. And in the halls of Washington, military leaders realized the power of morale, not as a side effect of operations, but as a strategic instrument in its own right. The Doolittle raid had not merely been a military plan, it had been a message carved into history with wings and fire. Across the Pacific, the message was received differently. For the Japanese military, the raid was nothing short of a national embarrassment. The idea that American bombers could strike the capital, flying deep into what Japan considered its most secure airspace, was almost unthinkable. The Japanese public, conditioned by propaganda to believe in the absolute safety of their homeland, found themselves shaken. How could the Americans, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, reach so far? The leadership responded with a mix of fury and fear. Demands for a decisive victory intensified. Resources were drawn from the outer campaigns to harden homeland defenses. Civil defense drills became more frequent. The Imperial Navy, once confident in its perimeter strategy, now viewed the American carriers as a direct existential threat. These shifts were not temporary reactions. They were strategic recalibrations that shaped every Japanese decision for the next year. The raid also exposed fractures within the Japanese high command, tensions between aggressive expansionists and more cautious commanders who worried that Japan's operational reach had extended too far. Yamamoto, though respected, felt the weight of responsibility heavy upon his shoulders. His plan to draw the Americans into a trap at Midway was approved rapidly, propelled by the urgency the raid had created. And in a twist of history's irony, it was precisely this rushed ambition that would lead to Japan's catastrophic defeat at Midway only weeks later. Thus, the Doolittle raid, though small in physical scale, set in motion a sequence of decisions that toppled the balance of power in the Pacific. But the raid's consequences did not fall on military leaders alone. In the villages and towns of eastern China, the price paid was steep. Japanese reprisals against the Chinese population were swift and brutal. Entire communities that had aided or sheltered the American raiders became targets of massacres, bombings, and destruction. Tens of thousands of Chinese civilians perished in the aftermath, victims not of the raid itself, but of the rage it triggered. For the raiders who survived, this cost haunted them long after the war ended. Many spoke with deep sorrow of the suffering endured by the Chinese people who had risked everything to save them. Their gratitude was lifelong. The bond between the Doolittle raiders and the Chinese civilians who helped them became a quiet but enduring chapter in the human story of the war, a reminder that alliances are often written not in treaties, but in acts of compassion. As the war progressed, the legacy of the raid evolved. In the months following Midway, the United States shifted decisively to offensive operations. Island by island, battle by battle, American forces began closing the distance toward Japan. The Doolittle raid became a reference point, a moment when the tide had first begun to turn, not through overwhelming force, but through audacity. Long after the guns of war fell silent, the story continued to echo. James Doolittle, who had once feared court-martial, became a symbol of fearless innovation. His raiders, those who lived, those who died, and those who suffered captivity, were honored as examples of extraordinary bravery. Each year, the surviving raiders gathered for a reunion, clinking silver goblets engraved with their names. One goblet remained unturned for each man still alive. When a raider passed away, his goblet was inverted. As the decades wore on, the number of upright goblets dwindled, but the story they represented never dimmed. Their mission served as a lesson in the nature of resolve. It showed that in war, morale can shift battles before armies ever meet. It revealed that small acts of defiance can reshape global strategies. It proved that even in the bleakest moments, the courage of a few can revive the spirit of a nation. Today, the Doolittle raid is remembered not for the damage it inflicted, but for the courage it embodied. It stands as a testament to a universal truth, that in the face of overwhelming odds, boldness can chart new paths, and determination can pierce uncertainty like a beacon through storm clouds. The world of 1942 is gone, its empires changed, its borders redrawn, its veterans aged or passed. But the story of that mission, of those 16 bombers rising from the heaving deck of a carrier into hostile skies, retains its power. It speaks to something timeless in the human condition, the need to rise after being struck, to answer fear with action, and to declare through deeds rather than words that surrender is not an option. In the end, the Doolittle raid did not just stun Japan. It reminded the world that America, though wounded, was far from defeated. It showed that the nation was only beginning to fight. And through that message, written not in ink, but in fire, it helped change the course of history.